Welcome to the Friday Men's Breakfast Podcast, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. In this week's lesson from the book of 2 Samuel, Tim Latham, who serves as the Associate Pastor of Adult Ministry at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, will be walking us through the account of David's being anointed as king over all of Israel. So open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 5 and join us as we continue to learn how the life of King David leads us to the life of King Jesus.
When I looked at 2 Samuel 5, I see it as a kind of a collage of a lot of different things happening. And so instead of reading straight through, I'm going to read it in sections and have talk about each section and the picture that begins to emerge about the type of king that David is as he's being anointed here in 2 Samuel 5. So first I'll look at 1 through 5, and I'll just kind of read it and then we'll go through it. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Here we are, your own flesh and blood. Even while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led us out to battle and brought us back. The Lord also said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them at Hebron in the Lord's presence, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began his reign. He reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So I think these first verses, the first picture we have of David here is as the patient king, where God's long-promised shepherd king finally takes the throne that he was prepared for. And I realize that you all have been walking through 2 Samuel for a while, so you probably don't need a refresher. But verses 1 through 5 are the culmination of a long process. God sent Samuel to anoint David all the way back in 1 Samuel 16 as the chosen future king, probably about 15 years before this. A lot of scholars, if David is 30, here he probably was chosen as an early teenager. This has been a long time. David spends years living as a fugitive from Saul. Even after Saul's death, we have this war between Judah and the northern tribes of Israel. So David is only king over the southern tribes for 7 years. So there's a long period of waiting. And after all that fighting, now we finally have peace. David is finally anointed as the king of all Israel. And we've been talking about waiting a lot at the chapel this fall as well. It's part of the series on Exodus, and asking questions like, how do we wait well? How do we trust God when we feel like we're in a wilderness in our lives? Because we all have things in our life where it feels like we're waiting for God to keep those promises. Right now, my family's been in this condo for about 3 months. Hunter had to get through a gate to pick me up and evade a bunch of geese that hang out on the road. And we have to keep canceling things and pushing back. We keep on making plans to move in and then pushing it back 2 weeks at a time. And that changes how everything in our life operates, right? Because you might say, hey, I can sleep on a pull-out sofa for 3 weeks, but maybe you wouldn't have said that if you knew it was going to be 3 months. There's lots of things, these things kind of add up. Or others of us, wilderness can be something we experience at work, not knowing what to do professionally, feeling unsettled in our jobs, not having confidence in our finances or in our house or in our health or with our marriages or other relationships in our family or with friends. We all have situations where we wish God would make things clearer, make things a little easier, or at least make things stable. But the good news is that God is faithful and keeps his promises even if we have to wait for them. Our waiting is a part of God's plan. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity where he says, "I am sure that God keeps no one waiting unless he sees that it is good for them to wait." That's so challenging. Right? I think of God wanting us to wait, of us needing to wait for a purpose. But if we look back here at David, so if David was a teenager when God chose him to be the next king, then you could ask, well, what kind of king would David have been at 13 or 15? What kind of king would you have been at 13 or 15? But now, as we see the people coming together to proclaim David as their king, they point to these important things. The flesh of my flesh, the blood of my blood, the familial connection they have with David. They point to his staunch leadership, how he was the one who led them in battles, who proved himself in terms of leadership. They point to God's promises that they've seen manifest in the person of David. And they point to David's history as a shepherd, that he has proven that he is the type of king that will care for his people, that will not just be only a good general, but a shepherd who tends to the flock that's entrusted to his care. So this is the maturity that God has produced in David while he was waiting, while he was in the wilderness, while he was a fugitive from Saul. So we can look at the shepherding and the waiting kind of backwards in David's life. We can also take the shepherd imagery and move it forwards. Because whenever we read shepherds in the Bible, like we think about David, we think about the Psalms, but it also prepares us for Jesus. In the Gospels, people were waiting on a new David, and they were hoping that this Messiah would be a warrior king like David, who could throw off the Roman Empire and establish Israel as a military and a politically autonomous power. There's all sorts of history where a lot of the people in Israel at the time were ready for a revolution, and that's what they were hoping for. The new David who would be that sort of Che Guevara king for them and would reclaim Israel's rightful place in the political hierarchy. But instead, God was preparing the people for patience. He was giving them endurance and preparing them for a different type of David. Jesus is the new and better David, not as the general, but as this shepherd king, the good shepherd who lays down his life for his people. So what I want to say here about 1 through 5 and the patient king is that God's timing is not our timing. And sometimes we need to realize that when we are waiting, God is preparing us for something that will require maturity, patience, grace, or endurance. He's preparing us for the road ahead. So we'll keep on going with verse 6 here. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the land. The Jebusites had said to David, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and lame can repel you," thinking, David can't get in here. Yet David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. He said that day, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites must go through the water shaft to reach the lame and the blind who are despised by David. For this reason it is said, the blind and the lame will never enter the house." David took up residence in the stronghold, which he named the city of David. He built it up all the way around from the supporting terraces inward. David became more and more powerful, and the Lord of armies was with him. So I'm calling this section the promised king because there's a slight change from talking about the political leadership to the geography of the time, the ins and outs of the battle, because it's not just about the person of David, but it's about the land that God is giving to David and to Israel. And actually, this takes us back even further because God isn't just fulfilling these promises he made to David as a boy 15 years ago, but promises that God had made to Abraham around 1,000 years earlier. There's one critical phrase here in verse 6, marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the land. So does anyone here know anything about the Jebusites? Any Jebusite nerds? Dale, are you a Jebusite nerd? Okay, that's okay. I should have asked Dale because Dale might have known the answer, and that would have destroyed the whole bit. Yeah, we don't know much about the Jebusites, but it all comes back to Genesis 14 and 15. And don't worry, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. But so in Genesis 14, that's right after Abraham, then Abram, and his nephew Lot decided to split up. right? So Lot goes and camps near Sodom and Gomorrah, which becomes a pretty big problem later on. You guys might remember that story. But it's also a problem right away, because right after this happens, a war breaks out between 9 different kings. I'm not going to give you all the kings' names. It's a little bit confusing, but there's 4 kings on one side, there's 5 kings on the other, and Abram's nephew Lot gets caught in the middle because he's living near Sodom and Gomorrah, and he gets taken hostage, and all of his land is taken over. And then somebody comes and tells Abram, hey, your nephew Lot is basically a hostage in this war. And so in Genesis 14, he's like, well, I'm going to go save Lot. And so he leaves and he meets a guy named Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is one of the coolest people in the entire Bible. He's really awesome. He's this mysterious priestly king who has some unexplained connection with God that we could talk about for a couple of hours. It would be really fun. So we should do that. Anyway, but he goes really deep. And Melchizedek rules over this town called Salem, is how we would say it today. And he gives Abram bread and wine, and he blesses him, and he assures Abram's victory in the upcoming battle. And then Abram defeats all the kings and rescues his nephew Lot. And then in Genesis 15, God says, based on what you have done and who you are, he makes these covenant promises to Abram. And Genesis 15 says, starting in verse 17, when the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So that's where we hear the Jebusites. Okay, so you're like, okay, what is the point of all of that? Okay, what is the point of all of that? Well, when we're reading here in 2 Samuel 5, this is about fast-forwarding about 1,000 years. So 1,000 years later, and in that time, the city of Salem that Melchizedek had been ruling has been conquered by the Jebusites. So when David conquers Jerusalem, which most scholars think is the same location that Melchizedek was the king of in Salem, he is not only inheriting this special city that has a priestly significance for God, but he's also fulfilling the promise that God made Abraham by finally taking over the land of the Jebusites, of all these people that God had promised him his ancestors would inherit at the original covenant. So he is fulfilling the land promises that he had given to Abraham 1,000 years earlier. J.I. Packer, in Knowing God, which is one of my favorite books, says, the fulfillment of God's promises depends not on our faithfulness, but on his. So first we have that this is God's timing and not ours. Now we see that it's really God's faithfulness and not ours, and I see it's a theme developing. So let's move on to the next section, starting in verse 11. King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David. He also sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as a king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. After he arrived from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. I didn't really practice those. Dale, I don't know if I did those right. Here's the secret, is if you say something with enough confidence, people assume it's right. And I'll do you a little, so when I was at the chapel the first time, I was like a pastoral intern and we had to read the scripture. And one of my first weeks up there, I was supposed to say like Caesarea, right? From like there was the town named after Caesar. And I didn't know how to pronounce it. And so I said Caesarea, like a C-section. And I got in a lot of trouble. So Okay, so I'm calling this section the imperfect king. So it starts off really good here, right? King Hiram, he sends these materials. He helps build David a palace in this new capital city of Jerusalem. And the nations recognize his authority as king. And we have this really beautiful glimpse of what a king should be in God's eyes. And this is in verse 12, where we see David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. David isn't king for his own sake, for his own benefit, but for the sake of God's people. There are a lot of other examples in the Bible or in the modern world where kings and rulers and politicians tend to see their authority and power in terms of their own benefit, right? We've seen this in history. We've seen this in the newspaper. We've seen this. How can they get their way and remake a nation in their own image? How can they command more respect and reverence? How can they maximize their wealth, their power, or their popularity? A lot of people take leadership as a chance to improve themselves. But this is not the way that it's supposed to be. Tim Keller said that if you are in a position of influence, you are there by God's appointment to serve, not to be served. That's the biblical motto of leadership. It's in the shepherdness that we talked about earlier. It's serving, not being served. There is an inherent tension in ruling between stewardship and caring for the people you're supposed to care for using the gifts that God has entrusted to you, and self-glory that comes from the honor of being king, the honor of being in charge, the honor of being revered in that society. And we see that tension lived out very fully in David's life. So our reading here, it's kind of, it's almost like a matter-of-fact biography, right? This isn't trying to lead you one way or the other about what's happening. It's just, this is like an AP news clipping. This is just the facts of what's happening, and you can try to read between the lines to figure out what that means. So this starts with the right idea, but the biographical data, when we see that there's more children, there's more wives, and there are more concubines, that David starts to accumulate. So Hunter told me this is a good crowd for polygamy jokes. So if you raise your hand, who here is married? Who here would like to have 7 more wives? Thank you very much. All right, now nobody tell your wife that Tim made that joke, or nobody tell my wife. But seriously, I met a person years ago who earnestly believed that the Christians should be polygamists because our example should be David. Right? He saw the life of David. He's like, well, if we're going to be like David, then we should have a lot of wives. And he was hoping to find a church that would support him carrying out that vision for his life. And I really struggle with that because I think that's a bad reading of the Bible. That is, just because something happens in the Bible doesn't mean that it's recommended. Bill Wark used to say when he was talking about the text, we have to figure out if this is something that's prescriptive or is that just descriptive of a situation. And so David and Solomon, they had multiple wives, but that's descriptive of what they were doing. It wasn't being celebrated or advised. In fact, as we process through the rest of 2 Samuel, we're going to see how David's starting to add wives and concubines leads to destruction and disaster, both in David's family and for all of Israel. This is a bad thing that's starting to happen. I've also heard people say that, well, that was the way of the ancient world, and we're looking at David through modern eyes, and he didn't know any better. But again, God's idea of leaders existed before David conquered Jerusalem and established it as his new capital. Back in Deuteronomy 17, we read this advice for what a ruler or leader should be for God. He says, he cannot acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses. For the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. He must not acquire many wives for himself so that his heart won't go astray. He must not acquire large amounts of silver or gold for himself. When he is seated on a royal throne, he is to write a copy of this instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the priest. It is to remain with him, and he is to read it from all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe all the words of this instruction, and to do these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from this command to the right or the left, and he and his sons will continue reigning many years in Israel. So this whole section is showing that there is goodness in David's kingship, but there's also brokenness. We are seeing the first signs of him drifting away from what the Lord has called him to as a leader, of turning away to start prioritizing his own wants and desires over God's will for his life. And that's going to become a major theme in the life of David. And I feel like I'm starting to go long, and I don't want to go too deep on another tangent, but there's also a lot of discussion in pastoral or theological circles about how we see David today. On one extreme, you have people like this guy I met who wanted to be the next David with having multiple wives. You have people who see David as this kind of biblical superhero, someone we should strive to emulate in all the ways we can, and who think he never did anything wrong. And in the other extreme, we have people who look at the terrible things that David did and want to write him off as a bad guy that we shouldn't look to at all. And so what I'm advocating here is a sort of middle ground, because David was this imperfect king. He was flawed. He was broken. And that's what makes the story so beautiful, because we are flawed. We are broken. We are imperfect too. I know I don't know all of you all that well, but I'm guessing that most of you have not killed a friend so that you could marry his wife whom you had already impregnated. That probably hasn't happened. David did that, right? And yet he still sought forgiveness. He repented. He worshiped. He was a man after God's own heart, and he is fondly remembered for generations that came later. So you are never too far gone to be used by God for a good purpose, to be renewed, to be restored by God into a right relationship with him and with others. This is what God does for us through Jesus, restoring imperfect people to his perfect fellowship. So let's go to our last section, the longest one, and starting in verse 17. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they all went in search of David, but he heard about it and went down to the stronghold. So the Philistines came and spread out in Rephaim Valley. Then David inquired of the Lord, "Should I attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me?" The Lord replied to David, "Attack, for I will certainly hand the Philistines over to you." So David went to Baal Perazim and defeated them there and said, "Like a bursting flood, the Lord has burst out against my enemies before me." Therefore he named that place, "The Lord bursts out." The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. The Philistines came up again and spread out in Rephaim Valley. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not attack directly, but circle around behind them and come at them opposite the balsam trees. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, act decisively, for then the Lord will have gone out ahead of you to strike down the army of the Philistines." So David did exactly as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Geba to Gezer. So I'm calling this section the listening king, because this is getting into the battle practices that David uses to defeat the Philistines. And there are a bunch of theories about the different ways this happened. What do we know about ancient geography by the way these battles take place? I think the key here is that David listens for God's guidance. Okay, so in verse 19, David inquires of the Lord, what should he do? And God's answer is, attack. Attack, for I've already prepared the way. In verse 23, David inquires of the Lord again what he should do. But this time, God answers, don't attack, circle around, and wait to hear from the trees. The point is that God's methods vary, but our need for dependence on him shouldn't. So here's a quick pastoral pop quiz. Does anyone know the quote, "God helps those who help themselves"? Anybody know where that's from? Okay. Thanks, Bill. Bill ruined it. Yeah, it's not biblical. It's not from the Bible. It's from Poor Richard's Almanac. Ben Franklin wrote that. But lots of people think it's biblical, right? It kind of sounds like it, but it's giving us a different message, okay? Because what Ben Franklin would say was like, hey, David, learn your lesson the first time. If you ask God for advice and he says attack, then the next time just attack. Like learn, be responsible for your own self. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Do what you need to do. Learn your lesson. But that's not what God is asking here. God wants us to learn to listen to him before we attack, right? God wants us to deepen our dependence on him, to learn to trust and obey. For us, this means understanding that spiritual maturity, it's not about outgrowing dependence. That's something I think we think of as kids, right? Like a child, as they grow up, they get to do more things by themselves, right? They get to play by themselves. They get to go outside by themselves. They get to walk down the road. Eventually, they get to ride a bike. Eventually, they get to drive without you in the car. Eventually, they get to leave the house and go to college and make bad decisions and good decisions by themselves, right? This is a part of being independence. That's what we think of maturity is I am now less dependent on my parents. But that's not how spiritual maturity works. It's not about outgrowing our dependence on God, but deepening it. Too often we want to problem solve. We want to act quickly and fix something, to pull ourselves out of a situation by sheer willpower, by our ability, by our strength. But before the fight comes listening. From a biblical perspective, true strength is submitted strength. True strength is seen when it is obedient to God. So 2 Samuel 5 shows us that David is a patient king, that it's about God's timing and not ours, that he is the promised king, that all of his success is not about our faithfulness, but God's. He is an imperfect king. He is a flawed individual, but luckily the answer is not about our ability or goodness, but God's. And finally, he is a listening king, where success is dictated not by our wisdom, but by God's. See, the good things about David are born from his obedience to God's will, all the successes in his life. The bad parts of his life, in the same way, come from a lack of obedience to God's will. It's when he disobeys what God has called him to do, when he turns away from the pathway that's in front of him. So the challenge for us is, well, how can we deepen our commitment to obedience? How can we be the version of ourselves that God has created us to be, that he desires for us to be at work, in our homes, and in our community?
Thanks for joining us today. I hope you will join us for the next episode of our study of 2 Samuel. Until then, our prayer is that you will grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, the Savior and the King.